The flames painted shadows on Jake Morrison's face as he emerged from the burning house, his turnout gear covered in soot. In his arms, he cradled 8-year-old Tommy, the last member of the Carson family to be rescued from their burning home. The boy's mother, Laura Carson, rushed forward with tears streaming down her ash-stained cheeks, her hands trembling as she reached for her son. "He's okay," Jake assured her, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Just some mild smoke inhalation. The paramedics will check him out." He handed Tommy to Laura, watching as she clutched her boy close, her shoulders shaking with relief. From behind the police barrier, Maddie Chen raised her camera, capturing the moment for the Metro Herald. Her heart swelled with pride as she watched her boyfriend of 3 years doing what he did best, being a hero. The photo would accompany her article about the dramatic rescue, but more importantly, it would be a testament to the man she loved. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of ceremonies and media coverage. Jake received the department's Medal of Valor, standing tall in his dress uniform as the fire chief pinned the medal to his chest. Maddie sat in the front row, beaming, her recorder capturing every word of the speech about courage and sacrifice. But something changed after that night. Jake grew distant, spending long hours at the station even when he wasn't on shift. His usual playful banter over morning coffee became short, distracted responses. When Maddie tried to draw him out, he'd smile that same reassuring smile he gave victims' families and say everything was fine. It wasn't until she was doing laundry that she found the note. It had fallen from the pocket of Jake's uniform pants, a handwritten message on pale blue stationery. "Dear Jake, words can't express my gratitude for what you did that night. You didn't just save my children's lives, you saved mine. I know the burden you carry, but please know that you're our guardian angel. If you ever need someone to talk to who understands, I'm here. Laura." Maddie's fingers trembled as she read the words again. The paper was worn at the creases, as if it had been unfolded and refolded many times. She noticed a phone number written at the bottom, the ink slightly smudged. That evening, when Jake came home, Maddie watched him more closely. The way he checked his phone when it buzzed. How he'd step outside to take certain calls. The slight smile that would cross his face when reading certain messages. "I'm thinking of doing a follow-up piece," she said casually over dinner. "About the families you've saved. The long-term impact of trauma and recovery." Jake's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "I don't think that's a good idea," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "They need time to heal, not media attention." "The Carsons seem to be doing well," Maddie pressed, watching his reaction. "Especially Laura. She's been very appreciative." Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "They lost everything in that fire, Maddie. Their house, their memories, nearly their lives. They're still processing. And you're helping them process?" The question hung in the air between them. Jake set down his fork and met her gaze. "I do what I can. It's part of the job." But Maddie had interviewed enough people to recognize evasion when she heard it. As a journalist, she knew that the real story often lay in what people didn't say. And right now, Jake's silences were speaking volumes. Later that night, as Jake slept beside her, Maddie lay awake, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. She thought about the note, about the way Laura had looked at Jake at the medal ceremony, about all the little changes in the man she thought she knew so well. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from her editor about tomorrow's deadline. But as she reached for it, she noticed Jake's phone light up with a notification. In the dim light, she could just make out the first line of the message: "I know it's late, but I really need to talk." The sender's name was L.C. Maddie turned away, her heart pounding. She was a journalist, she knew how to investigate, how to uncover the truth. But for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure she wanted to know the whole story. The monthly firefighters' family support meeting wasn't the kind of event Maddie usually covered for the Metro Herald. But there she sat in the community center's fluorescent-lit room, her press badge conspicuously absent, watching Laura Carson adjust her chair in the circle of attendees. The woman's dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, her clothes simple but carefully chosen. She looked nothing like the ash-covered, desperate mother from that night. Jake stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding yet gentle as he addressed the group. "Trauma doesn't just end when the flames go out," he was saying. "It lives in the quiet moments, in the memories we carry. That's why we're here, to share those burdens together." Maddie watched Laura's face as Jake spoke, noting how the other woman's eyes never left him. There was something in that gaze that made Maddie's stomach tighten, a mixture of vulnerability and connection that felt far too intimate for comfort. After the formal meeting ended, people broke into smaller groups, sharing coffee and conversations. Maddie lingered near the refreshment table, pretending to text while straining to hear Jake and Laura's conversation in the corner. "The nightmares are getting worse," Laura was saying, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tommy won't sleep in his own room anymore. He keeps asking about his father's pictures, the ones we couldn't save." Jake leaned closer, his expression filled with concern. "Have you considered the counseling program we discussed? I can't afford it right now. The insurance settlement is tied up, and with the temporary housing costs." Laura's voice cracked. "You're the only one who really understands what we went through that night, Jake. The only one who was there." Maddie watched Jake's hand move to Laura's shoulder, a gesture meant to comfort, but it lingered a moment too long. The touch held a familiarity that sent warning signals through Maddie's mind. Later that evening, in their apartment, Maddie tried to focus on writing her latest article, but the words kept blurring on her screen. Jake was in the shower, and his phone lay on the coffee table. It buzzed with an incoming message. Her fingers itched with the desire to look. As a journalist, she'd always believed in the pursuit of truth, but this felt different. This was personal, invasive. Yet the memory of that touch, that look between Jake and Laura, pushed against her principles. The shower was still running when she picked up the phone. The message preview showed on the lock screen, "Thank you for today. Your words meant everything. LC." Maddie set the phone down, her hands shaking. She was barely aware of Jake entering the room until he spoke from behind her. "Checking my messages?" She turned, caught between guilt and defiance. "Should I be?" Jake's expression hardened slightly. "You tell me, Maddie. You're the one investigating. Is that what you think I'm doing? Investigating you? Aren't you? The support group meeting? The questions about Laura?" He ran a hand through his damp hair, frustration evident in every movement. "I thought you trusted me." "I did. I do," Maddie corrected herself. "But you've changed since that night, Jake. You're distant, distracted. And Laura. Laura lost everything," Jake cut in. "Her husband was traveling for work that night. Do you know what it's like to tell someone their entire life went up in flames while they were away? To see that kind of guilt in someone's eyes?" "No," Maddie said quietly. "But I know what it's like to watch someone I love slowly slip away." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake moved to the window, staring out at the city lights. "I have a responsibility to these families, Maddie. It doesn't end when the fire's out. And what about your responsibility to us?" She stood, moving closer but not touching him. "Where does that fit in?" Before Jake could answer, his phone buzzed again. They both looked at it, the screen lighting up with another message from LC. Jake reached for it, but Maddie was faster. "Don't," Jake warned, but Maddie had already unlocked the phone. She knew his password, had always known it. Trust had never been an issue before. The message thread opened, revealing weeks of late-night conversations, shared confidences, and emotional intimacies that made Maddie's heart constrict. Nothing explicitly inappropriate, but the cumulative effect was devastating, a parallel emotional relationship that had been growing right under her nose. "It's not what you think," Jake began, but Maddie cut him off. Then what is it, Jake? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're getting lost in someone else's tragedy instead of dealing with your own. She handed him back his phone, gathering her laptop and keys. I'm going to stay at my brother's tonight. Maybe you can use the time to figure out exactly what kind of hero you're trying to be. As she closed the door behind her, she heard Jake's phone buzz one more time. The sound followed her down the hallway, each step taking her further from the man she thought she knew, and closer to a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Rain drummed against the windows of Marcus Chen's apartment as Maddie curled up on his leather couch, watching her brother prepare tea in the kitchen. The familiar scent of jasmine filled the space, a comfort from their childhood that now felt bittersweet against the chaos in her mind. You're overthinking this, Marcus said, setting down 2 steaming mugs. His voice carried the measured wisdom of an older sibling who'd seen his share of life's complications. Jake's always been the type to carry other people's burdens. It's what made you fall for him in the first place. Maddie wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into her bones. This is different, she said softly. You didn't see them together, Marcus. The way they look at each other, the way he responds to her needs. It's like he's found someone who speaks a language I can't understand. Marcus settled into his armchair, studying his sister with the kind of attention that had made him a successful therapist. The language of trauma, he suggested. Jake was there on what might have been the worst night of Laura's life. That creates a bond, whether they want it or not. But does that bond have to threaten everything we've built? Maddie's voice cracked slightly. 3 years together, and suddenly I feel like I'm losing him to someone else's tragedy. The rain intensified outside, matching the storm of emotions churning inside her. She thought about the messages on Jake's phone, each one a small crack in the foundation of trust she'd thought was unshakable. Tell me something, Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. Are you more afraid of losing Jake, or of discovering that the man you love isn't who you thought he was? The question hit her like a physical blow. She set down her mug, the tea suddenly tasteless. Both, she whispered. Neither. I don't know anymore. Her phone buzzed, a message from Jake, please come home. We need to talk about this. She stared at the screen until it went dark, reflecting her troubled expression back at her. You know what the hardest part of my job is? Marcus asked, breaking the silence. Watching people destroy good relationships because they're afraid to face the uncomfortable truths about themselves or their partners. Jake's not the only one changed by that fire, Maddie. She looked up sharply. What do you mean? I mean that maybe this isn't just about Jake and Laura. Maybe it's about you struggling to accept that the man you love has depths of empathy that sometimes take him places you can't follow. The words settled over her like a heavy blanket. She thought about how she'd approached this situation, the journalist's instinct to investigate, to find the story, to expose the truth. But what if the truth wasn't about betrayal at all? He's keeping secrets, she said, but the words sounded weak even to her own ears. Is he? Marcus challenged gently. Or is he trying to protect something fragile, not just Laura's healing, but his own? Have you asked him what that night really did to him? Maddie remembered Jake's face when he'd emerged from the burning house with Tommy in his arms. Not triumphant, but haunted. She'd written about his heroism, but had she ever really asked about his fear? Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a longer message from Jake. I found something in the ruins of their house that night. Something I've never told anyone about. Please come home so I can explain. Marcus noticed her expression change. What is it? I think, Maddie said slowly, I've been asking all the wrong questions. She stood up, gathering her things. I've been so focused on what Jake might be hiding, I never stopped to consider what he might be trying to protect. Be careful, Marcus warned as she headed for the door. Sometimes when we go looking for answers, we find truths that change everything we thought we knew. The rain had softened to a gentle patter as Maddie stepped out into the night. Her journalist's mind was already spinning with possibilities, but for the first time since finding that note, she felt something else beneath the suspicion, a glimmer of understanding that perhaps this story wasn't about betrayal at all, but about the complex ways trauma binds people together, and the price of carrying others' pain. As she drove home through the wet streets, she thought about Laura's words at the support group, "You're the only one who really understands." Maybe it was time to stop being the investigator and start being the person who could understand not just the hero everyone saw, but the man who carried the weight of that night in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. The apartment was dark when Maddie returned, save for the soft glow of the lamp in Jake's home office. She found him there, surrounded by paperwork she'd never seen before. Bank statements. Wire transfers. Insurance documents. All bearing Laura Carson's name. Jake looked up as she entered, his eyes carrying the weight of sleepless nights and unspoken burdens. On his desk lay a charred metal box, its surface scarred by flames but its contents somehow preserved. "I found this in their study," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "The night of the fire, while searching for survivors. It was hidden behind a false panel in the wall." Maddie moved closer, her journalist's curiosity warring with the tremor of anticipation in her chest. The box contained documents, financial records, photographs, and a USB drive. But it was the photographs that caught her attention. Laura's husband, Richard Carson, in locations across the world, always in the company of different women. He wasn't just traveling for business, Jake continued, spreading out the documents. He was living a double life. Multiple affairs, secret bank accounts, stolen company funds. Laura had been gathering evidence for months. The revelation settled over Maddie like a heavy fog. She was planning to expose him. Jake nodded, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "The fire started in Richard's home office. The investigation ruled it accidental, faulty wiring. But Laura, she thinks Richard found out she knew. That may be." "The fire wasn't an accident," Maddie finished, the pieces falling into place with devastating clarity. "I've been helping her build a case," Jake admitted. "Quietly moving money back from the accounts he hidden, documenting everything. If Richard discovers she survived with evidence." The weight of understanding pressed against Maddie's chest. This wasn't about emotional affair or misplaced hero worship. It was about protection, justice, and the kind of secrets that could destroy lives. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out softer than she intended, more hurt than accusatory. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he gathered the documents. "Because you're a journalist, Maddie. A damn good one. If you knew the truth, you'd be legally obligated to report it. I couldn't put that burden on you. And I couldn't risk Laura's safety." The silence between them felt different now, charged not with suspicion, but with the complexity of love and duty colliding. Maddie thought about all the late-night messages, the secretive meetings, the tension she'd misinterpreted. A different story emerged, one of sacrifice and protection rather than betrayal. "I watch you write stories about everyday heroes," Jake continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But sometimes being a hero means carrying secrets that tear you apart. Every time I look at Tommy, I see a kid who might have lost everything because his father chose greed over family. Every time I talk to Laura, I remember how close they came to." His voice broke, and Maddie saw what she'd been missing all along, the toll this secret had taken on him. The way it had hollowed him out, forcing him to distance himself from everyone, including her, to protect a truth too dangerous to share. She reached for his hand, feeling the slight tremor in his fingers. "Let me help," she said. "Not as a journalist. As your partner." Jake looked at her, surprise and relief warring in his expression. "It's dangerous, Maddie. If Richard finds out." "Then we'll face it together," she interrupted. "You've been carrying this alone for too long." A notification lit up Jake's phone, another message from Laura. But this time, when Maddie saw it, she felt something different. Not jealousy or suspicion, but a fierce determination to protect someone who had already lost too much. She picked up one of the photographs, studying Richard Carson's smiling face as he posed with another woman, oblivious to the camera catching his betrayal. "We need to be smart about this," she said, her investigative instincts kicking in. "If we're going to expose him, we need to make sure Laura and the kids are protected first." Jake stood, moving to the window. In the distance, sirens wailed, another emergency, another potential tragedy. "There's more," he said heavily. "The insurance investigation. Richard's been asking questions. He knows someone accessed his office before the fire. He's coming back next week." The words hung in the air like smoke, carrying with them the promise of confrontation. Maddie felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with a breaking story, but this time it was personal. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth, it was about protecting it, and those who carried its weight. Outside, the city lights blurred in the rain-streaked windows, each gleam a reminder of the countless stories hidden behind closed doors. But this story, their story, was far from over. And as Maddie watched Jake's reflection in the glass, she realized that sometimes love meant choosing to face the fire together, even when the flames threatened to consume everything in their path. Dawn broke over the city, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose as Maddie sat at her desk, surrounded by the fragments of lives unraveled. Each document from the charred box told a story of deception, bank statements revealing Richard Carson's elaborate web of financial fraud, photographs documenting years of infidelity, emails threatening former associates who dared to question his methods. The truth had weight, she realized. It pressed against her chest with each revelation, each piece of evidence making the burden heavier. Now she understood why Jake had grown distant, why he'd carried this knowledge like a stone in his heart. Jake entered quietly, setting a cup of coffee beside her. The morning light caught the shadows under his eyes, revealing the toll of sleepless nights spent protecting secrets that weren't his to share. "Laura called," he said softly. "Richard's flight lands tomorrow afternoon. He's demanding a meeting with the insurance investigators." Maddie reached for his hand, feeling the slight tremor that betrayed his exhaustion. "Have you told her what we found about the other fires?" 3 other properties, all connected to Richard's business ventures, had burned under suspicious circumstances over the past decade. Each time, the insurance payments had flowed into offshore accounts, carefully hidden beneath layers of shell companies. "She's scared," Jake admitted, sinking into the chair beside her. "Not just for herself, but for the kids. Richard, he's not just coming back for the insurance money. He wants the evidence she gathered. All of it." The weight of decision settled over them like a heavy blanket. They had spent the past week piecing together the puzzle of Richard Carson's crimes, but knowledge brought its own kind of danger. Each path forward carried risks they couldn't fully calculate. "We could take this to the police," Maddie suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. They both knew the reality: Richard's connections ran deep, his influence reaching into corners of power they couldn't hope to challenge directly. Jake shook his head, his expression haunted by memories of that burning house. "He'll bury it. Just like he buried the other investigations. And Laura, she'll lose everything. Again." The sound of traffic filtered up from the street below, a reminder of the world continuing its normal rhythm while their reality shifted on its axis. Maddie stood, moving to the window where she could see the city awakening. "When I found that note," she said quietly, "I thought I was losing you to another woman. I never imagined I was watching you try to save her." Jake joined her at the window, his reflection overlapping hers in the glass. "I've spent my career running into burning buildings, thinking that was what courage looked like. But this, watching someone rebuild their life from ashes, standing up to face the person who tried to destroy them, that's real bravery." Maddie turned to face him, seeing not just the hero who had emerged from flames carrying a child, but the man who understood that some rescues required more than physical courage. "Then we help her be brave," she decided. "But we do it smart. We do it in a way that ensures Richard can never hurt her or anyone else again. She moved back to her desk, pulling out a fresh notepad. Years of investigative journalism had taught her that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't confrontation, but careful, methodical exposure of truth. We have 12 hours before Richard lands, she said, her mind already mapping out the strategy. If we're going to do this, we need to make sure every piece of evidence is bulletproof. No loose ends, no room for doubt. Jake watched her work, recognition dawning in his eyes. This was the woman he'd fallen in love with, not just for her compassion, but for her unwavering pursuit of justice. Laura wants to meet, he said. Tonight, at the support group. She needs to know she's not alone in this. Maddie nodded, understanding flowing between them like an electric current. Tell her to bring everything she has. Every document, every photo, every piece of evidence she's gathered. It's time to stop hiding from the fire and start fighting back. As Jake reached for his phone, Maddie caught his other hand, holding it tight. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said softly, we face it together. No more secrets, no more carrying these burdens alone. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the room. In those shadows, Maddie saw the shape of the choice before them, not just about exposing one man's crimes, but about standing together at the crossroads of truth and consequence, ready to face whatever flames might come. The community center's meeting room felt different at midnight. Shadows gathered in the corners, and the usual warmth of shared healing gave way to something more urgent, more profound. Laura sat at the center table, her hands steady as she arranged years of gathered evidence before her. The woman who had once seemed like a threat to Maddie's relationship now appeared as something else entirely, a mirror reflecting the quiet strength that often went unrecognized. I spent so long being afraid, Laura said, her voice carrying the weight of countless sleepless nights. Afraid of the truth, afraid of being alone, afraid of what would happen if I finally stood up for myself. But watching that fire consume everything, it showed me that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you're truly made of. Jake stood by the window, his firefighter's instincts keeping watch over the darkened parking lot. The past week had changed him too, not back to the man he was before the fire, but into someone who understood that saving people sometimes meant more than carrying them from burning buildings. Maddie spread out her own files, each carefully prepared document a piece of the story they would tell. The insurance investigators will be here at 9, she said. Richard thinks he's walking into a routine meeting about the fire claim. Instead, he's going to face every truth he tried to bury. The evidence was overwhelming when laid out together, the pattern of suspicious fires, the fraudulent companies, the stolen lives and broken trust. But it wasn't just about exposing Richard's crimes anymore. It was about reclaiming power, about transforming victims into survivors. I used to think being a hero meant running into danger, Jake said quietly, moving to stand behind Maddie's chair. But watching you both these past weeks, I've learned it's about having the courage to face the truth, even when it terrifies you. Laura touched the charred box that had started it all. When you pulled Tommy from the fire, I thought that was the moment that saved us. But it wasn't. The real saving happened in all the moments after, in choosing to stand up, in finding the strength to rebuild, in learning to trust again. Dawn was approaching when they finished their preparations. The first hints of morning painted the eastern sky as they walked to their cars, the weight of the coming confrontation settling around them like a familiar blanket. I need to tell you something, Laura said, turning to Maddie. That night, when Jake saved us, I wasn't just grateful. I was desperate to feel safe again, to believe in heroes. I latched onto him because he represented everything I thought I needed: protection, strength, salvation. Maddie felt the last pieces of her old jealousy dissolve, replaced by understanding. We all need something to believe in when our world burns down, she replied softly. The trick is learning to believe in ourselves. Hours later, they sat together in the insurance company's conference room, watching Richard Carson's carefully constructed facade crumble in the face of irrefutable evidence. His threats turned to pleas, his arrogance to desperation. But it wasn't his downfall that marked the day's victory, it was the quiet strength in Laura's eyes as she faced her husband's lies without flinching. The investigation that followed made headlines for weeks. Maddie's article, when it finally ran, wasn't just about exposed fraud or attempted murder. It was about the courage of ordinary people choosing to rise from the ashes of their old lives, about the different faces of heroism, and about the transformative power of truth. 6 months later, they gathered again in the community center, but this time for a celebration. Laura's Foundation for Survivors of Domestic Fraud and Abuse was launching, funded in part by the recovered insurance money. Jake stood at the podium, no longer carrying the weight of secrets, speaking about the many forms courage can take. Maddie watched from the audience, her hand intertwined with Jake's as he joined her afterward. They had learned that love wasn't about protecting each other from hard truths, but about facing them together, about growing stronger in the broken places. Sometimes, Jake said as they walked home under the stars, the biggest fires we face aren't the ones that burn buildings, but the ones that transform us from within. Maddie squeezed his hand, thinking of all the ways they had changed, all the truths they had faced together. And sometimes, she replied, the greatest act of heroism is simply choosing to rise, day after day, from whatever ashes life leaves behind. Above them, the night sky stretched endless and clear, each star a reminder that even in darkness, light finds a way to shine through. They had all been transformed by fire, not just the physical flames of that fateful night, but the internal fires of truth, courage, and redemption. In facing those flames together, they had forged something stronger than steel, the unshakable knowledge that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another, more powerful tale.